So I'm thrilled that we have Tiffany Bova with us today, and we're going to learn from a real expert about growth. She was at Salesforce. She's the best-selling author of Growth IQ, and she addresses this question of what do we really need to understand about growth in this new reality. So she was previously a VP, a distinguished analyst, and a research fellow at Gartner, and she's also worked for startups and Fortune 500 companies, including Sprint, Interland, and Gateway Computers. So we are ready to go. I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany and let her share a lot of interesting things with us. Tiffany,
well, fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And welcome everybody. I so appreciate your interest in spending time with us today to talk about growth and sort of what's going on from a market perspective. But, before we jump in, I just want to first say hello. I have been blessed over the last 18 months since my book published that it has now gone to 9 countries. And so we now have the opportunity to say hello in so many new other languages. But as was mentioned, my name is Tiffany Bova. I am the Growth and Innovation Evangelist at Salesforce as well. I'm an author and a member of the Thinkers 50 group. And so it was awesome to be asked to participate in this today. I would have done it virtually anyway, I guess, had we not been in the middle of a lockdown. But this conversation is moving so rapidly that just up until last night, I was still working on this slide deck of sort of what do I want to say and how do I want to say it. But I always begin with, let's set the scene. Let's set the scene for what's happening in the market today. And I mean, I could spend the full 25 minutes talking about this, but it's always important to me to set the context of the conversation. And this point in time of what's happening will be very relevant to the recommendations and advice that I give throughout as well. Hopefully the questions that you ask that we'll get to in a little bit. The first thing I want to start with is, there's a fantastic story if you've seen the movie Apollo 13 or know anything about American space and NASA. There was the Apollo 13 many years ago, and during the time that they'd lost communication, one of the directors in the room that was managing everything that was going on in the command center was, this could be the worst disaster NASA has ever experienced. But someone shot back and said, Gene Kranz said, with all due respect, sir, I believe this is going to be our finest hour. And so there are 2 ways you can look at this situation we're dealing with right now. This is, disastrous for small business and medium business, could be, obviously from a pure health perspective and loss of life, it is just catastrophic on so many levels. But if we just focus on the business side, what is the opportunity? What are the jobs that may need to be done that are identified and uncovered during this time? And that's really what we mean by it's going to be our finest hour, coming together and rallying as a globe, as a community, as a industry, whether you're in certain verticals or regions of the world. All of a sudden, we felt so close together. Now we feel so far apart, but yet technology keeps us close in so many ways. But at this point, we're at this unprecedented crisis. The financial crisis a number of years ago was sort of housing and financial services and banking. But now we're across the board from public health and businesses and what that actually means from an economic standpoint. So it's just far reaching. There is not a corner of the world that has not been touched with what's going on right now with COVID-19. And so the growth projections coming out from the IMF in 2020 are, they're challenging. It looks like there's going to be a -3% compression in the market. But this bounce back in 2021, whenever that may happen, it may happen in 60, 90, 120 days as countries and cities and communities start to lean back into opening back up. But at the end of the day, there's no way we can avoid the fact that there's going to be some compression in the market. And some industries are going to be hit harder than others. In advanced economies, it might even be deeper of a cut. And so what does that actually mean to everybody? But, overall, there's optimism. I wanted to show this slice that McKinsey put together, I guess in honor of Christy being here too. But, ultimately, they just did some recent research around COVID and what people think is actually going to happen from a recovery standpoint and when that is going to start to show itself. And so you can see that whether you're in the US or India or China, South Africa, Germany, Brazil, the UK, There is unsure, there's pessimistic, but there is a lot of opportunity. And in some of the developing countries, it's even more so because they have this opportunity to really leapfrog getting themselves back on track in using new innovative solutions to make themselves relevant and important to businesses on a global scale. But you also have the opportunity in certain industries where there is more or less interest in B2B predictions of growth, as well as softness in the market. So, it's hard to say, and I've been asked this often over the last couple of months, is, do I think companies are still buying? And my answer to you would be yes. Two things are true. Businesses do, at a very simplistic level, and I like to think of it this way, is businesses do two things. They do one, they make stuff, and two, they sell stuff. And so what that stuff is different. But within industries, there is obviously a ton of commerce still going on, especially if you're in a must-have need industry, healthcare, even thinking about education and how that happens now in a remote way, or even transportation. And what are we going to need in order to get ourselves back to work, whatever that looks like. In those industries, you can see huge opportunity. In others like transportation, airline, travel, that's really facing a troubling time. And as you've seen in oil and gas, I don't think it had ever happened where the oil barrel prices was negative. So, there are certain industries where it's getting hit harder than others, but plenty of opportunity if you can find ways to insert yourself in that need of what's going to happen over the next 3, 6, 12 months. Now, I would like to say, and I called this out in my book, that most businesses through their history, 85% of them will hit a growth stall at some point. But right now we are in this global growth stall where almost every business is feeling a softness from a revenue perspective. Once again, if you make stuff and sell stuff, you have to make sure that people are buying. And if people aren't buying, you're going to start to see a decline in those top line revenue numbers. And so many businesses are responding in different ways. Some are cutting costs. Some are doubling down and saying, look, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that my competition or others in my industry, or those that were really giving me a run for my money from a competitive standpoint, are pulling back, which gives me the open opportunity to double down. So even though we're in a growth stall at a global scale, there is still plenty of areas in which you can focus and grow. So now, what was the catalyst of this? As was mentioned, I spent a decade at Gartner, which is the largest industry analyst and consulting firm for tech companies specifically. And I spent a whole decade there talking to businesses about digitally transforming themselves. And it was very interesting during that time to listen to the reasons why they weren't willing to make the investments ahead of the curve. It's not the way we do it here. We tried it once, it failed. Our culture won't let us do it. One I really liked was our customers don't want it, or even our employees would not embrace it. But now we've been faced with this sort of wrecking ball of knocking down the status quo and comfort and certainty and complacency that this legacy mental model has really shown itself. I like to say that's kind of cracked open two sides. One is the lack of investment that was made from a technology and innovation standpoint to digitally transform. And I don't mean digital from a, let me modernize the data center digital. I mean digital in the way that you would take your employee capabilities and the tools and enablement you give them in order to do their job more productively, as well as serve your customers better. And so that really showed this sort of moment in time, has shined a light on that lack of investment. But it's also highlighted the companies that were already investing in this kind of new future of being very digital and agile and thinking about minimal viable products and being very iterative and having scrum teams and being okay with and measuring and rewarding failure, and really thinking about not being product-led. Like, this is the product we sell and isn't it so great, but being much more customer-led and starting with what is it that the customer actually wants from us, and how can we align ourselves to make sure we continue to deliver those things. So that for me was the catalyst to help move forward businesses that may have been a little bit more risk adverse, held back, waiting for that perfect right time in order to make those investments that they may have thought was not going to pay back a good enough ROI. And so the partner of the business today is the CFO. Absolutely, because they're the ones that are holding the purse strings, but they're also the ones that are trying to find creative ways. And don't hear creative to mean things they shouldn't be doing. I'm saying creative to say, how do we keep our doors open and our people employed while we at the same time deal with what's going on? So this is a time to think about the new future. I tend not to use the term new normal. There's a lot of reasons I don't use it. I don't use it because I feel like the normal or the place we left was still filled with a lack of investment and inequality in making sure that we were democratizing access to things like bandwidth. I'm located in Los Angeles, California, and you'd be surprised how busy the Starbucks parking lots are at the moment, not because people are inside drinking coffee, but because they're outside getting free Wi-Fi. You know, it's when the world has to manage itself and conduct itself in new ways, it really shows those that did not have access to the things we take for granted in many ways. And so for me, it's the new future. Now, what can history teach us? If we said, here's the reality, we've got a compression, we've got a global growth stall, we've now exposed the fact that the digital economy has to really think differently about what got us here and what eventually will get us there. And so what are the things we can take from the last crises we've hit? Here's two that I wanted to highlight. This is US-based data, but you have 9/11, you have the financial crisis, and you can see that the sort of births and deaths of business may have declined, but always bounced back. And so that's the positive on the other side of this, that there are so many small businesses that come online and offline every year. I mean, the average business in the US, the average is smaller than $5 million. It's a couple million. The majority are single proprietor or 2 or 3 employees. And so getting to the $5 million mark is a huge hurdle. And so that contraction and expansion that happens just on a natural basis is being accelerated at the moment. But hopefully on the other end of this, which I'm fairly confident about, is going to be this additional business growth. And so what did it teach us? There was revenue impact, but you may actually, and I want to qualify this and put this in context, right? This is during the recession of the financial services market and the housing, going back to one of my original statements. This has hit us at a global scale in every corner. That was not this recession. And so I'm just leading you to see that while there was a number of businesses that were down a lot, 50% plus actually were able to maintain their revenue and or grow slightly. So even in times that were tough, people have found ways, creative ways to keep themselves afloat, keep their employees working and employed as well, keeping their customers served. So what can be this kind of post-COVID habits? And this is where I think there's plenty of opportunity. And one I'm sort of starting to think about. So I'm interested to hear what you think, because this is the first time I've sort of shared this outside of my little brain, as well as from a PowerPoint perspective and a presentation perspective. But I have some thinking about how we used to be and where I think we're going to go. And I don't think we're going to pivot all the way back to pre-COVID. Nor do I think we're going to stay exactly where we are today. I mean, I hope not, right? This is not the way we all want to live or interact. I mean, we're human. We like human contact, and we like the physicality of work and in our personal lives and education and all the things we get to do. And so I'd say that I definitely believe it's going to fall in between. But what will it teach us based on where we are today? Actually in Los Angeles this week, starting Friday, we're starting to open back up restaurants and malls. Although curbside service and things will be very different, we know that we're starting to find what that new business normal will look like. And so what are the things that we see? Well, businesses are absolutely adapting. You know, a restaurant that only had people eat inside, you know, is now doing curbside delivery, or businesses that did not have e-commerce or online capabilities and were only brick and mortar are doing that. Teachers who only taught in classrooms are now teaching virtually. Families who got together in person every Friday night are doing virtual dinners. Television shows are being recorded across Zoom with the actors in their own homes playing their roles of their TV characters in very unique and new ways. And you can see late night and concerts and ways to raise money for COVID, like what's going on today, is happening in this new and sort of virtual way, which is super inspiring. But what it will do is it will change the way we think about business going forward and what that will look like. And so what are your customers thinking about right now? They want to keep their own businesses afloat. They also want to manage this new remote workforce, which there's some research out there that's saying 30% of those who did not work remote will not come back to the office. They will stay working remote or in some hybrid way. And so what does that mean to the way you conduct business? Take support calls, have your sales force managed. How do you market? How do you keep them engaged in the culture and keep them feeling like they have an emotional and personal connection to the company that they work for? Really interesting things happening here. But more importantly, it's about this kind of revenue stability. What are the things that you need to do in order to do that? And this is where I think there's this tremendous opportunity to think about it in 3 lanes. And we've been doing some of this work at Salesforce, and this is kind of a framework we've just started to share, which is the first phase of it was kind of stabilizing the business. How do we help our customers stabilize what's going on? What are the things they need? Well, if they've never managed remote employees, how do you do that? How do you do that at scale? If they've never created a marketing campaign that is digital or via social platforms, how do they do that? Then they have to lean into, how do I get back to work? What does that look like? It's not a light switch you switch back on. It's going to be this phased approach. And then ultimately, it's going to be back to growth. Now, businesses, industries, regions, sectors, sizes will move through these 3 phases at very different speeds and at very different times. So in some parts of the world, stabilize is 30, 45 days behind them. In other parts of the world, stabilize, they're right in the middle of it. And now as we start to turn things back on and lean back into going back to work, that is a different speed. You'll start to slow down and stabilize, reallocate those resources that might have been focused there, put them in the back to work bucket. And then there's a small team in growth. And as back to work starts to get more mature and you get some days and weeks and months behind you, you're going to get back to growth. And so that's a great way to think about how are you allocating people and resources and money and time around these 3 tracks. Now, if there's nothing else I can tell you, that this job's to be done from Clayton Christensen and a lot of the work they did, especially in his one of his books, Competing Against Luck. I just wanted to highlight what businesses were founded during the Great Recession that are now massive parts of how we're actually communicating and working today. And so what are going to be those companies that are formed today that are going to be there for us 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when we may need them again? So this is that opportunity to say, what are the jobs that need to be done that are not able to be done today? How could we do things better? How could we do things differently? And what are the things we could actually show to the consumer who now has very different buying habits, very different personal habits, very different business habits than they had 3 or 4 months ago? And statistically and research-wise, it says it's 66 days or so for you to form a new habit, where we are well into a new habit, right? The new habit of not going to work, of being taught virtually, of having family dinners via, a video call, having trade shows like this. Like, our habits are different. We're working out at home, we're cooking more, we're not eating out more. And so to think that these habits won't stick is unrealistic. There are going to be habits that will absolutely stick. And so how do you navigate that? What are the things you can focus on, knowing there are now new jobs to be done, there are new habits being formed based on where you are in the world, you're in different phases of getting back to work and starting to focus again on growth, especially at the top line perspective. And I want to just make a caveat here on this, that when I talk about this, this is not about cost cutting. This is about how do we drive top line growth. So maybe M&A, but I'm not going to get into what are the things from a CFO perspective you should be thinking about in the P&L to cut costs to get yourself back to growth from a P&L perspective. I'm really talking about it from a top line organic growth perspective. So this is all about context. So I love this sketch because I think it just nails it on the head, right? I need help, I need a boat. The guy in the boat goes, I need help, I need land. And so depending on what company you were going into COVID, will have all kinds of implications on what kind of business you are going to be coming out of it. And what are the things you can focus on? So I'm going to hone in on a couple of ways to do that. The first one I'm going to say is that how businesses have survived going back to that recession, there's a few I want to focus on. It's expansion from an M&A perspective, but more importantly, customer loyalty, strategic partnerships, and really thinking about diversification. I'm going to hone in on those for a second. Remember, as I said, I'm not going to get into the P&L side or even the M&A side. I'm going to stay at top line organic growth. And so this is the framework of Growth IQ. I came up with 10 paths to growth. You know, there was a number of reasons I landed on that, which I'll give you the sort of 30-second overview. Was there should be nothing on this slide that you're surprised by. 4 of them are new modern twist on the Ansoff matrix. Others are modern twists on others. And what I did was I took social, mobile, cloud, big data, AR, AI, virtual reality, all the things we now have at our fingertips, and I layered that on top of the strategic growth strategies that companies have used for decades. And I said, how will that change? And that was the whole basis of Growth IQ. Not reinventing the wheel, but modernizing things people already feel comfortable on. So these are the 10 that I came up with. So the first one is customer experience. Now, this is really important. Number one, I'll start by saying your customers will only be as happy as your employees. If your employees are happy, they show up to work happier, your customers are happy. If your customers are happy, they buy more often, they buy more from you. And then if those two things are in place, your shareholders are happy. And it's this flywheel effect. And so customer experience today is about, are you transparent? Are you adding value when you communicate with them? Are you seamless? Are you quick in delivery? Are you there for them if they need you? Right now, customer experience means something very different than when these stats were done. But I want to tell you that how you behave today, how you respond to what your customers need and what your employees need will stay with you for a long time on what and how your customers will view your brand. So I want you to really make sure that you always keep the customer at the center of the decisions that you make about what you want to do going forward and what kind of company you want to be. The next one is like right at the core of who I am. I like to say that I call myself a recovering seller because I sold for so long, but I no longer carry a quota. But there is so much fat on the bone in inefficiencies around how you sell today. How many sellers you have, how productive they are. We have some statistics that show 66% of sellers spend their time, or 66% of a seller's time is spent on non-selling activities. And 55% or so of sellers will miss their quota. Now imagine what's going to happen now. How much time is spent on non-selling? Way more than that. How many are going to miss their quota? Depending on what industry you're in, could be higher than that. So you really have to think about what are the things I can take advantage of with sales enablement and sales operations today so that when we turn the dial and get back to marketing and selling in a way that feels a lot more normal, that you're prepared. Do the hard work now so that you make sure when you start to dim the light back on that you're ready for it. The third, and I think one of the most important and often ignored, is making sure you take care of the base of customers you've already acquired. You've spent time, money, and energy getting them in the first place. It's less expensive for you to sell to your base. They're more loyal, they're more forgiving, they're open to new products that you may launch. That is the gold you have. You need to really pay attention to what you're doing for them and not get so fixated in trying to go find net new customers and worry about what you can do there. You can do all that kind of enablement today in selling and marketing and trying new products and doing focus groups and listening to what your customers need. Do a listening tour, call them. What can we do to help? Look for those pockets of opportunity for jobs to be done that you're not doing today. Maybe it is an opportunity for you to partner with another company. Maybe it is an opportunity for you to do M&A, but the place to start is your employees and your customers. And so start in the base before you ever start to go out to net new, out in the environment. So for me, oversimplistic, obviously, but in many ways, growth is a thinking game. I think those that win in the market outthink their competition. They're just a move or two ahead. They're 18 months ahead of where their competitors are. People are playing catch up, and that has everything to do with agility and speed and thinking in advance. I don't need you to worry about what's going to happen, 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now, or 3 years from now. I want you to worry about what's going to happen through 2020 and potentially through 2021. So the first thing I'd say is start with the beginner's mind. What I mean by this is I do not want you to forget everything you know, but I do not want you to say it's not how we do it here. We tried it, it didn't work. You've got to think about, can I free up a little bit of my time? And doing something like this webinar today all day is investing in you and looking for new ideas and stimulation. I listened to Renee's on Blue Ocean and the things that you could be doing. That was fantastic. Or even Dan Pink's session. There was so much great content. I was taking a slew of notes. I blocked off my day as well. I'm like, look, if I get to listen to everybody in one day, I'm going to do it as well. So it's an opportunity to think about how do you open up your mind to make small pivots over time so that you can see a market improvement or change over the course of 12 to 18 months. Start with your employees. Are they safe? Are you giving them what they need? Are you empowering them to do what's best, not only for their family, but also for your customers? The competitive landscape has forever changed. Who you used to compete with, they may be gone. And so what are the things you can do to actually capitalize on that opportunity? Maybe it is that you go to them and say, look, let us take care of your customers. Is there something we can do together? This is not the time to say, I want to go out and crush my competition. You want to win, but you want to make sure that you're looking at who your competition was yesterday versus who they're going to be 6 months from now. And then lead with values. Make sure you're doing what's right. Make sure you are keeping everybody safe and that you're being transparent and authentic in the communication about what you're doing well and what you're not doing well. This is an absolute time that we have faced where the Edelman Trust Barometer showed that there was a crisis of trust before this happened. And so we have to make sure that we continue to work through those values and share those values with our customers. And what you do today will impact tomorrow. The decisions you make today, the communication you have today, the people that you keep on your payroll, those you are unfortunately have to let go. Plants you have to close, new regulations you have to follow, new safety measures you put in place. It's going to be really tough to find our way through, but it will have an absolute impact on your company tomorrow. And then last, I'd say the change starts with you. We can all make more money. We cannot make more time. So doing things like this is a great way to make sure you're investing in yourself of tomorrow, but also the business you're going to have of tomorrow. And it has to, as a leader, as an individual contributor, you have a lot of influence about how you can make sure that you keep the optimism high and that people understand their role in the business and how each and every day when they show up, it makes a difference. It makes a difference to your business and it makes a difference to your customers. So my question to you, what will you do different? What will you do differently because of what you've heard here today? I don't mean just my session. I mean around the globe, following the sun, everything that you've heard through all the sessions. What will you do different? Write down the 3 top things you want to work on that you're going to do different. Make it manageable. I know that you probably have pages and pages of notes, no question, but you've got to distill it down to something that can be actionable. Because at the end of the day, you've got to be bold. You've got to say, look, I'm going to take a risk and go for it because I believe in myself, I believe in my people, I believe in my company, I believe in our culture and the values as well. I want to make sure I consistently serve our customers. So further inspiration for you, for me, is I have a podcast called What's Next. As well, you can pick up the book. It's now translated in 9 languages. So, hopefully it's in the region of the world that you are. But with that, I think we are going to open it up for questions.
Absolutely. That was fantastic, Tiffany. So thank you so much. And there's a lot that was coming in on the chat as well as in the Q&A. So for those of you that are listening, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A. We'll make sure that we address some of them. You know, people really appreciated the fact that you reframed it from being the new normal to the new future. So there's a lot of exhaustion with that new normal sort of phrase. And there are some
Good.
questions that are coming
I kind
in,
of feel
you
like
know,
I'm
even
losing
some
that,
around.
so please use it.
Okay. So all of you hopefully heard that. Tiffany says, please use that language and make sure people are adopting it. There are some questions that are coming in. You know, let's start with one around just general impressions that you have around growth and what companies are doing. You hit some really good points around customer loyalty, strategic partnerships, and diversification. In reality, are companies watching and thinking about that? And then in particular, are there some companies you think are doing that really well?
Well, I think there's so many examples of businesses stepping up from a partnership perspective, you know, to solve big problems. So, you know, if it's FedEx to bring in PPE equipment, working with some manufacturer or some, you know, big business that wants to donate it and pulling partnerships together, you know, trying to solve a supply chain that is getting taxed with all kinds of issues at the moment. So, you know, what's inspiring for me is when people get out of their comfort zone, right? And they get comfortable with being really uncomfortable, because everybody's really uncomfortable. They don't know what's the right move. And the good news here is there is no one way to growth. It's a combination of multiple things. And so it could be, do I reach out to partner in order to solve this particular issue I'm having right now? Maybe it is logistics. Maybe it is supply chain. Maybe it is your call center. Maybe you're not going to have access back to your drivers or to those that are out in the service industry. How do you actually make that happen? And so we see it in our customer base, whether it's companies like PayPal helping from, you know, the unbanked and the bank to waive fees. We see other places, you know, will say, look, you're not driving your car. We're going to eliminate portion of your car insurance. And while that doesn't seem like any of those, it has everything to do with loyalty, right? Remember I said it, how you behave today will have huge implications about what your customers think of you when they needed you. Were you there for them? So I feel like there's so many ways that that question could be answered. But I would tell you that in the subtlety behind who is teaming together to solve healthcare, education, supply chain issues, those are really inspiring. If you move past that and you get to things that are more business oriented, this is where I was saying, is there an area where you've wanted to just go a little bit outside your core business and find ways to introduce new products and services to your basic customers?
Excellent. Thank you. That's very helpful to hear. It seems like there is quite a bit of opportunity. There's a question from Anna around leaders and what you think they need to unlearn in order to be successful in the next new normal. So what are your thoughts on that?
So this is the, if I never hear it's not how we do it here, you know, I said it 3 times during this, right? Because it's one of my hot buttons of like, when I say to somebody, hey, have you thought about this? And I go, oh no, that's not how we do it here. I hope that leaves the nomenclature, right? I feel just as passionate about that as I do the new normal. So, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, this is the beginner's mind is not about, I want you to forget everything you know. I just need little 1% pivots. I used to do my team meeting this way. I'm going to do it that way. You know, I used to only 2 or 3 people used to talk at our team meetings. Now I'm going to make it that everybody in the team has to actually present to the team, because now it's via video, and giving those introverts or the ones who didn't speak very often in meetings an opportunity to share, because you could get all kinds of really amazing ideas from them. Or, you know, you haven't left your office in many, many years. You manage from the 4 walls, but now you need to kind of get out there and talk to customers. And so from a leadership perspective, giving yourself permission to spend time, an hour or 2, just thinking, what could I do differently? And then acting on a couple of them. And mind you, some are going to fail and fail miserably. And those around you, you have to give them the permission that it's okay to fail, and put the metrics in place for them to be able to measure the fact that even though it failed, they tried. They were really trying to solve a problem for the business. So as leaders, it's about communication. It's about transparency. It's about leading with values, you know, bringing a lot more empathy and your heart to your leadership style. and really getting your people rallied around, getting back to work and helping to serve your customers again.
Excellent. I love that. And the fact that it can be a 1% pivot. It doesn't have to be a complete
Yeah, I mean, look,
unlearning.
if you think you're going to go, I'm going to completely be a different leader, you know, it's not realistic. So I think those small lean into things is the right way to go.
And then there's a bit of a follow-up question around sales leaders. And in particular, is there something that sales leaders can do knowing that their team may not meet their quota? They might have more time. How can they better allocate that? So what advice would you give to sales leaders?
Yeah, this is a great question. I actually went out to Twitter and LinkedIn and asked this question, and I got 10 really good ones. And so I wrote a blog about it. And the top few of them were like, how do I sell when I used to sell face-to-face and now I'm, you know, I'm an inside seller. Everybody's an inside seller. And in some industries, you know, there is very little selling going on. If you think about car dealerships, imagine being a car salesman. It's like no one's showing up. And so what are the things that you can do? So this is an opportunity where you can take your field sales force, 2 words, and now that they're inside, maybe you start to allocate current accounts so that your current customers get touched by someone during this time, that you're reestablishing relationships, maybe even those people who sold in the field and sold them originally that they don't get a chance to talk to anymore, that those sellers can actually go back out and reach. So that's one. The second is, you know, what is not the right tone and messaging to be selling right now? Like, is it not appropriate to be like, I'm trying to sell, you need to buy? And this is my piece of advice here is let your customers set the pace. Let them set the pace, meaning once you reach out, if they don't respond, don't just keep hitting them day after day after day. They may not want you to communicate with them, or something, you know, unfortunate may have happened. So you have to make sure that you let your customers set the pace. How do they want to communicate? Email, chat, video. How often? Daily, weekly, monthly? I don't ever want to hear from you again. I don't know. But at the end of the day, that piece of advice would be let them set the pace.
That's very good advice. So thank you for sharing that as well. And even on engagement, you know, we are seeing there's some comments on the chat around that engagement as a sales leader. Are there certain metrics that they should be looking at that can help people know what pace to set?
Yeah, and this is one of the 10, right? It's kind of like, do the metrics need to shift? Yes, because if you're looking at, you know, forecast, pipeline movement, you know, I'm going to get really tactical here for a second, you know, like how many deals have moved from a stage to another stage, like the normal metric, or how many calls did you make, how many emails, how many meetings did you set, how many demos did you give, whatever it might be, those traditional metrics. We've been promoting for some time now that you needed to have more of the soft metrics like Net Promoter Score, customer satisfaction, and this is another opportunity. And so maybe it is, you know, how many customers have you reached out with our messaging about how we're bringing this back? You know, how many customers have you reached out to say, I'm just checking in with you, making sure you don't need anything from us. And so versus just purely looking at it from a revenue pipeline forecast deal velocity standpoint, you know, that you start to look at other things. And I'd say from a pure quota attainment standpoint, I mean, if you haven't shifted the quota for your salespeople, like, you know, that's not the right message to send. Let's just say that.
Well, especially given your point that if your employees and your team is happy, that will also translate into a better customer experience.
Yes.
There's a question around customer loyalty. And is there a link or a different way to think about that given that brand loyalty may be diminishing? So what do you see as that link between customer loyalty and brand loyalty?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think if you look at some of the strongest brands sort of pre all this happening, there are a couple of things that are aligned. It is employee satisfaction. And so if you look at something like the best places to work lists, right? And then you say, let me look at the lists of, and across the board. So, you know, regionally, globally, there's all kinds of these lists of the best places to work. And there's also the same thing around lists of the most innovative companies. And then there's other lists of the fastest growing companies. And no coincidence that when those first two are in place, the third one is also there, right? And so thinking about loyalty from a very holistic standpoint of every employee impacts customer experience. Customer experience impacts loyalty. A first purchase is, I'm willing to give you some money and I'm going to try this out. The second time they purchase for you, that is the validation that they value what you're doing and there's a level of loyalty. The third time they buy from you, there's a higher sense of loyalty. If they start then having a very strong relationship with you from a loyalty perspective, they start advocating on your behalf. And your greatest sales organization is actually your customers advocating on your behalf, because you could never hire that many salespeople sort of singing your praises. And so the flywheel of customers telling your story is why loyalty and making sure that your employees have what they need to enable them to serve customers better. But loyalty is, if you do things like customer satisfaction scores, it's sometimes a lagging indicator. Net Promoter Score is giving you sort of a real snapshot in time of what you could then adjust from there. But if you don't have your sales optimized and you don't have metrics in place to be more customer oriented, people will just default back to the behavior of whatever their metric actually is. So whatever you measure them on, however you manage them, is where they will spend their time. So if you don't make adjustments to those metrics, they're not going to do what you're asking them to do. So you have to put some wood behind that arrow of, if you're going to manage it and you're going to measure it, you have to give them the ability to do the things that really matter in the eyes of the customer.
Absolutely. I mean, people do respond to incentives, and what gets measured gets managed. All of those
Absolutely.
things
Absolutely.
that have been around. Yeah, there is a question around convincing leaders. So we have folks at all different levels here on this call. So there's a question from Lisa around, how do you convince leaders in the new future that pacing, speed, deeper listening, customer experience is central to this new change? And then do you have any examples of who's doing it particularly well?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this way because this is my always go-to default answer for this. So depending on where you are in the world, there's a show called Undercover Boss that's in the US, it's in the UK, it's sort of, where a executive from a company goes undercover into their own business to see what's going on. And in the first few minutes of the show, they actually put makeup or a disguise on that executive so that when they show up, no one recognizes them. So my thought process here is, I don't know why they waste that television time, because no one would recognize them anyway, because they never leave their office. So, the fact that you have to have a show that puts you in disguise to know that, your supply chain is broken and your employees aren't happy and they don't have what they need to be successful, shame on you as a leader. So ultimately, here's what I'd say on how to answer that is, I'm a firm believer in not trying to force my thinking on executives about, I know for a fact that customer experience and employee engagement is really critical to your growth. And they'll look at me and go, oh, that's that consulting speak. There's no metrics to follow it. Like, I don't know the ROI and we manage on ROI. That's how I run my business. It's how I've always done it. And so I say, don't try to be that squeaky wheel. The best thing you can do is actually have your customers tell your leaders that story. And so the voice of the customer is really critical, meaning, is there a way for you to go and survey your customers right now? Is there a way to actually physically call them or have customer advisory boards where you put teams of people together in certain industries or sizes, and you do a Zoom call and you just ask them a series of questions and you let the executives listen? That is the fastest and easiest way for them to go, oh, so-and-so, Sally, John, Bob, whatever, was right. But it's so much better when it isn't you trying to tell that message for whatever reason. A third party coming in and saying it, whether it's a McKinsey or, somebody else on the Thinkers 50, or some consulting firm or, a vendor like a Salesforce or whatever it might be. It's like, oh, you have an agenda. There's an ulterior motive. But from a customer perspective, there's no motive. And so it usually, more often than not, will validate those pieces of advice. And so companies that have clear line of sight to customers, voice of that customer, advisory boards, listening tours, anything like that is super critical. And I mean, there's so many examples that I can give, but you may hear, oh, that's a whole nother group and a division. I'm just going to give Salesforce as an example. We're 42,000 or so strong from an employee count perspective. Our voice of the customer team is 11 people. 11 people. And so they're not the only ones that do it, obviously, but they're the ones that put the structure in place of how do we capture, what do we capture, what do we do with that information, how do we share it internally, how do the executives see it, how do we do follow-ups, how do we create those kinds of engagements. And so you have to have somebody that is the voice of that customer from external to internal to bring back that voice so your executives know why it's important to focus on those things that you just asked. Great question.
Well, and I love how you answered it. So keeping it really focused on the customer and let the customer tell the story versus being the squeaky wheel, potentially getting frustrated.
Although I love squeaky wheels, right? But you have to kind of have both. So I don't want you to go quiet. I just need you, I need you to have a partner, and that partner could be the customer.
Absolutely. I think that's great.